YouTube? Welcome back to another History Teacher Reacts video in Mr. Terry's. I continue my search for historical knowledge found here on the internet. Alright, today's video comes from our awesome patrons over at Patreon. And they voted on this video for this week's poll, which is what if the United States didn't exist by Alternate History Hub. So we've done a few of these alternate history videos, and they've been interesting. And these guys at Alt History Hub are kind of the big boys at it, which has been great, and I've enjoyed all the videos. So I think this could be interesting because the United States is such an impactful nation across the world and has been so ever since its inception. And looking at what it might look like if it didn't exist, just off the top of my head, I'm not really quite sure where they're going to take it. So I think this could be really interesting to see what they kind of have here. So we'll see what's going on and where they start. If they just kind of start with, I don't know. I mean, there's so many places you could start. If you just start with explorers never come to the Americas, you never get early permanent colonies like Jamestown with the British or something like that, or United States does get founded, but it's still as a colony, and the American Revolution never takes place. A lot of different ways it can start, and I'm sure they'll get into that right away. So interested to see what they got here and add any feelings of mine if I can there. All right. If you like the original video, go down below. Links down there. Make sure you click it so you give them a view, like, subscribe, all that kind of stuff. And if you like what we're doing here, love to have you as a sub too. All right, let's go ahead and get started. This is one of the countless scenarios that could have happened had history gone down a different path. Okay.
In the grand scheme of human history, the United States of America is an incredibly new country. From its culture and the scale of its military and economic might, the US has been influential since its inception. In the span of just 2 centuries, it went from a disunified band of colonies into the strongest power that has ever been seen. Even by its creation, the United States drastically changed the course of history. So, as a thought exercise, what if it didn't exist? What if, in an alternate timeline, the United States of America never existed? Opens up a lot of questions, doesn't it? For this alternate timeline, let's go back to the 1770s.
Okay, so we're going to go back to what, right before, I guess, the Revolution. 1775, the Revolution breaks out, or at least some of the fighting starts, because the causes go back much further than that. I mean, I like to usually go back to the 1750s to the 7 Years' War between Britain and France, and then that really establishes and solidifies British dominance. But a lot of different, like I said at the beginning, a lot of different ways that you could take this. So, okay, so let's start here right before the Revolution.
The American Revolution, as tension grew between the colonies and the British. In this alternate scenario, war begins. The American rebels fight against the British regulars. There were many numerous occasions the US could have been defeated. All it simply took was not having the aid of one foreign ally, an ally who would love to get back at the British. Yes, that's right, the French.
Okay, I like this alternate scenario where you still have the Americans fighting, but France never gets involved, which is such a huge help for America. Because the United States, a lot of people don't know, the colonies, the American colonies, win actually very few battles in the American Revolution. Most were failures, right? And one of the strategies for sure that helped the United States was just outlasting the British. And the fact that the longer this war went on, the more it helped the American cause. Specifically back in Britain, because you get tiresome of the war, and lose support of the war from your population, and that definitely happened by the end of the war. The British public even was not behind it very much anymore. Didn't think it was really worth the time, and it's hard to win, nearly impossible to win a war without public support. Plus, you got to remember too that America is a small little piece of the French Empire, or the British Empire, and what Britain is doing globally there. So having France get involved, which was useful, especially because they had French military, the French had a navy, things the Americans really did not have in real professional capacity that much, especially early on. But the interesting thing about France getting involved is France really has no purpose and really point of them really being a part of the American Revolution, other than to sort of stick it to their old enemy, what they had lost to in the 7 Years' War and things like that. But also remember too that a lot of this is going to affect France in a way. It's going to cost the French a lot of money. To get involved in this, and also something that the French people didn't really support either. And not long after the American Revolution, the French Revolution starts. So there are some indirect consequences here. So, okay, I see the take here. America's going to fight, but the French aren't going to help. So America's going to be on their own, which is going to pretty much doom them, which is very likely the scenario.
The French involvement in the American Revolution saved the rebellion, and without it, the militias surely would have lost. And this wasn't a small contribution. The French involvement meant funding to rebels, supplies, guns, men, and ships, particularly to distract the British naval fleet. And France wanted revenge so badly, they put themselves in massive debt just to...
And just remember the French. Who are we talking about? Do you think some poor peasant in the countryside of France gives a single crap about France putting their citizens on the line, sail them out at a credible cost, and risk their lives to go fight the British for a land that France no longer has influence over? No. We're talking about the French monarch. We're talking about the French government here, because they are an absolute monarchy, and that's how things run there, that what they say is what goes. So that's really, I think, what we're talking about.
Aid the Americans. This would come back to haunt them later. I'll talk about that soon. Say in this alternate scenario, France is more fiscally responsible and realize they can't win a war without tanking their finances, and the US is left out to dry. After years of holding out against Native American, British, and German regulars, it's just too much. So, the rebellion crumbles. The British seize control, and most of the Continental Congress goes into exile or are arrested. Perhaps negotiations occur between the two to make amends, but this is hard to predict.
You know, something because I've been asked this before, what if the United States, failed there? What would the United States end up being? And a lot of people say, like, well, if America had fought. Because if America never had fought, then the safe answer you could say of what would America be like is Canada, right? Canada doesn't have a revolution, but is slowly given more autonomy and things like that. The United States would probably be like Canada. But had America failed, tried and failed with a revolution, what does it look like? I think it looks more like India. They tried this thing in the Sepoy Rebellion, and it ends up being a national revolt, and that's a story for another time, but tried something kind of similar in a way. And what ends up happening was they end it in the mid-19th century, and then Britain rules basically even harder, right? Now, one thing to contrast with, though, is that India is far more important as a colony than America was. More resource heavy and stuff like that. So maybe a smaller scale version of what happened to India and becoming under direct rule.
In this alternate timeline, the revolution is crushed, and the experiment that was the United States of America is in the history books, a failed rebellion over anger with the British Parliament. It can't be left unsaid that there is still bitterness among a sizable portion of the colonial population. There's still this culture within the colonies that resent the loss. While the war ends and a majority of American colonists simply move on with their lives, there's still a mentality similar to the South will rise again. The relationship between the two is forever changed. The 13 colonies were already kinda different from the rest of the British realms, but now going into the 1790s and the 19th century, it would be painted as the rogue colony which still has an independent tendency. There are immediate changes that result from the US not existing. When the US won the Revolution, in the Treaty of Paris, it was given all of the land east of the Mississippi River. Right. In this alternate scenario, the 13 colonies simply remain the 13 colonies. This changes multiple things, including the path of the British imperial ambitions and the politics of North America as a whole. Let's talk relationships. Okay. In this alternate timeline, the American colonists don't have the best relationship with their neighbors. Catholic French Quebec is to the north, and would be despised by the deeply Puritan colonists. And the numerous Native Americans to the west would be an issue as well, except for a few tribes, but I'll discuss that later. In our timeline,
the British did a pretty good job at recruiting a lot of Native American tribes, basically for saying that, hey, if you fight with us, then we'll protect your lands, because the locals here, the colonists, are not going to do that. They're gonna keep pushing you off of your land. So helping to recruit people like that. Same thing with they were recruiting African Americans, saying, "Hey, if you help with this, we'll end slavery and stuff like that." So we're pretty good at recruiting locals, which is something the British needed. One of the things, by the way, that the British were really banking on, which never really fully came to fruition and wasn't as helpful as they thought, is during the actual American Revolution, the British expected a lot more British support from the Americans, more loyalists, as they were called. It was patriots, loyalists, right? Patriots were those who supported the American independence cause, and then there was those that were loyal to Britain. And they thought that would at least, there'd probably be maybe like half or so of the population, and maybe that was true in a way, but they never actually really showed up and actually fought or helped the British. It was one of the things that they, again, were banking on, but never really helped.
When the US was born, Quebec was pushed up to where it is today, and the natives were under American control. But with control of this land under the British Parliament, American colonists are sort of stuck on the coast. In this scenario, Canada, as we think of it, simply doesn't exist. What eventually became Canada...
I mean, it doesn't exist because it would have blended much more with America. In fact, back to my previous point about loyalists, a lot of them, instead of basically fighting for the British, ended up moving up north to what today is Canada, because sentiment there, pro-British sentiment, was a lot stronger there than it was in more in the South. So a lot of them, rather than help the British fight, just bailed up to Canada that way. So
had a large population boost after the war from loyalists who fled the independent United States. It's said that these loyalists were the initial boost that brought Canada as a territory for Britain, being happy to be under the king's rule and all. But without independence, these loyalists stay in the colonies. So Canada doesn't have an influx of English-speaking Brits. But you know what it does have? French Canadians. This land was once under the control...
Interesting point. I didn't think of that. It would be the territory, although it's more unified in a way, but this is still, they're talking after the 7 Years' War, so I mean it's still British dominance. French influence really kind of left after started to leave in this part of the blue part, here. But interesting, it would be more divided in the fact that that's interesting, because you think of the United States and Canada as very divided. It would be even more now, I guess, because it would stick again with the French influence. A lot of people don't know too that the French established colonies before the English did, so it's older. The French Canada is older than English America.
Or the French in something known as New France, but France lost this land after the 7 Years' War. French colonists were allowed to stay and keep their culture as long as they stayed loyal to the British king. Thus, Quebec was born. In this alternate scenario, Quebec never loses this land and stays incredibly large, one that takes up all of the Great Lakes, the Ohio River, and goes up into the northern seas of the Atlantic.
So you can see there, what we're talking about is parts of America today. So you got like the eastern part of Minnesota, you got Michigan, Wisconsin, I guess further below the St. Lawrence River, which is kind of the border for today. Okay. But they said they would have been driven up. Maybe I'm missing something. Why are they able to go further south? Because I thought they said the opposite.
Had Quebec continued to be allowed to rule these lands, the Midwest and the Great Lakes are French-speaking, deeply Catholic territories. But there is a third culture as well. Most of the land south of the Ohio River is entirely populated by Native American tribes. If the treaty with the natives continued, then the British protect native land rights in the Deep South. Inside this territory was...
If they do, right? If they make do with those promises, like I was saying in the beginning, if they came and fought, then they would be protected that way. So it's almost like America becomes... What was America becomes far more divided, actually.
What was known as the 5 civilized tribes by the Americans: the Creek, Choctaw, Cherokee, Chickasaw, and Seminole. They were called this because of their general acceptance of many colonial practices into their society, and the colonists held by comparison pretty good views of the natives as well, in comparison to other minorities. It was often thought that if the native tribes simply adopted European culture, they'd be on equal footing with the colonists. As decades go
That never happened even close.
by in this alternate timeline, interaction with British Americans and the Quebec Canadians slowly alter these 5 tribal societies into adapting more European practices.
Okay, so they're saying they would have adapted them more, though, than what actually happened after the revolution? Because what generally ends up happening, later on, you get things like the Trail of Tears and stuff like that, which they just remove those people out west, put them in Indian territories. It was called under Andrew Jackson, into places like Oklahoma. So, okay.
Not much can be said other than the native tribes of the South remain prominent members who may eventually adopt colonial ways. Who knows? It's commonly taught in school that the American Revolution had an immediate impact throughout the world. And that's true, just not in the way we think. Remember when I said France was a key ally to the American rebels?
What happens to
that
French
aid
Revolution?
required money. That money had to come from somewhere, and the French monarchy didn't have it. The monarchy put itself into a large amount of debt. This debt created a financial crisis, and without getting into too many details, this was the crisis which led to the chain of events that eventually brought down the monarchy.
I think we are overstating the American Revolution's impact, because France already went into debt from the 7 Years' War too, and the other things that hurt France was the famine in the 1780s for ingredients to make bread and stuff like that. So, as far as if they're going to go ahead and say the French Revolution never happens, I don't know. I'm not necessarily convinced of that, but it's in the realm of possibility.
Led to the French Revolution, and eventually Napoleon.
Napoleon.
In this alternate timeline, Britain crushes the American rebels, since France doesn't get involved. Sure, the French monarchy is still in debt, but without this financial crisis, because no war, they can kick that can down the road by at least a few decades. By doing so, Napoleon's opportunity to seize power doesn't happen. The Napoleonic Wars never occur. The Holy Roman Empire is not obliterated by the French invasion, and hundreds of...
Okay, Holy Roman Empire was basically nothing by the time Napoleon came around. It was basically just Austria, so it was already a shell of its former self.
Little German states aren't reorganized into 30 with
that
the
is true, though.
Confederation of the Rhine.
That is true, though, but a lot of Germany wasn't even part of the Holy Roman Empire anymore by this time, but it could have an effect. So if the French Revolution doesn't happen, they're saying German unification doesn't necessarily happen. So what, do we not get Bismarck and stuff like that? I think about that more.
There is never a rise of
A lot getting thrown out here, guys. Definitely, if you have comments as this is going, with this stuff or ideas, put them down in the comments, the comment section, or come over to our Discord server and talk about this. They're throwing a lot of dominoes into this, so I'm interested to know how you do it, because a lot of these, it's like I need time to kind of process.
Russia, and so the German Empire is never formed. It can't be underestimated how much Napoleon not coming to power affected global history, as Napoleon's forces invaded.
Because that is true. If there's no French Revolution, but if they're saying there's no French Revolution because there's no American Revolution, probably is no Napoleon. He came through the ashes of the French Revolution, and the nationalism that was created counter to him all over Europe was pretty great. So, okay.
Invaded Spain and Portugal, bringing their colonies into chaos. In this alternate timeline, without the United States, there is no immediate military catastrophe to weaken these empires. They remain prominent and powerful.
Because the American Revolution, you got French Revolution, and then you had a string of revolutions kind of after that, like the Latin American ones, because they all happened not long after the French Revolution, some even coinciding with it. So did those never happen? And then just the Spanish Empire stays? No, I think the Latin American revolutions are still going to take place. We're getting too far away from the source to start to make these that much more direct, I think.
Throughout the 19th and 20th centuries, the New World is still prime real estate for European colonization. The British and Spanish are pretty much the only ones left, with the Russians in Alaska, which leaves New Spain in the question. It's doubtful the Spanish would have risked war over the territory if the British wanted it enough. The British expand slowly across the North American continent. However, what changes is how they interact with the native tribes instead of the Americans. Manifest Destiny was a uniquely American ideal that wouldn't exist in this alternate timeline. Instead, it's like
Manifest Destiny basically stated for America that America had a God-given right to colonize the continent, right? That doing it was doing basically God's will and bringing civilization and modernity. So that was in a way justification for colonizing further west, especially after the Louisiana Purchase, into the western half of the United States, which was Mexico then. But if they're going further back, then it's still Spain, and I mean you're going to all kinds of things there. So that doesn't, yeah, that wouldn't happen. That wouldn't have happened. I mean, I guess colonizers would have gone out there. I wonder too if maybe if America, okay, so if maybe if the colonists had lost the Revolution, here's another what if. Would those hardcore patriots have then moved west to be like, hey, we're out of here. We're gonna get out of the British Empire and move west to the Mississippi and start trying to develop their own colonies over there out of the reach of the British. But then you'd be getting involved with France, you'd be getting involved with Spain or Mexico, depending on the timeline. So that's just something that came to my mind too. What do you think about that?
Likely the British would interact with the native tribes and give them autonomy, essentially splitting North America up into native-dominated provinces in the West with white colonists. This is the undoubtable effect of the United States losing the Revolution and not existing. The transformation of British imperial policy around the world. Think of it like soul-searching, but with warships. Losing the United States ended the First Empire, and the British funded exploration ships.
Not really. The British Empire endured much longer than that. I mean, I would say the British Empire doesn't end until the fall, or until India's independence in the 40s.
To go find new lands to settle. This led to the discovery of Australia and New Zealand. It also led to the British to become more invested in conquering lands in Africa and all of India. With North America, though...
I feel that's all part of the same thing, though, regardless of the U.S. But maybe I'm wrong.
Britain simply invests in this massive territory of land. As industrialization arrives, the British banned slavery and the slave trade as a whole. This would create extreme unrest in the United States, but the British still banned.
Yeah, that would have happened. Slavery would have ended in America far earlier, because even with the American Revolution and not having that workforce in America, the British still end slavery decades before the Americans did.
Slavery, and the issue is finished by the 1830s. The British have access to the bountiful amount of oil, natural gas, and coal left untapped in North America. The change here is the balance in power in the world. Not only that, but the balance of power in Europe. Germany remains divided for the entire 19th century, meaning World War I and World War II never occur. Yet some alternate war probably would happen. As for North America, the British Dominion of North America is a diverse land. The 13 colonies still exist and are culturally different from the rest of the continent.
So like the British basically do the manifesting of destiny. Okay. It'd be difficult, though.
Native Americans make up a predominant section of Western North America, while white colonists dominate the western coast. This is, however, simply one scenario. We'll never truly know what will happen. This is just one thought exercise. The United States has always been a land where people from around the world have came to create a new life. And since I'm here, and I have a life, that means that at some point in history, my ancestors had to have gotten on that boat, or flew as I like to imagine, and just stayed in the United States until generations later, I was born. I've always kind of wondered where my ancestors came from, so in sponsorship with Ancestry, I actually found out. Now for reference, my entire family has absolutely no idea where we came from. It was never discussed, and the furthest back I can trace my roots is Buffalo, New York. Since my last name is Franklin, I suspected maybe I had ties to Britain, but it was never really sure. Also, my skin was so pale, I thought maybe there was some Northern European DNA in there too. Without either side knowing where we came from, I decided to take a test for myself, and just in time, Ancestry contacted me. They have a service called Ancestry DNA. They mailed me a box, I spit in a tube, and then sent it into a lab. Using their DNA cross-referencing and gene comparisons, Ancestry DNA was actually able to pinpoint using my DNA where my ancestors had actually come from, or at least the general area. Basically comparing my genes to the similar genes of ethnic groups from around the world, and the results were pretty surprising. According to the test, I have 36% British ancestry, most likely from England, so the last name actually makes sense. The next was pretty surprising, 30% Scandinavian, particularly Norway or Sweden. Being from the Midwest, I thought maybe German, but nope, no German genes, just Scandinavian. The next highest was 20% Irish, and then a random 7% from Italy and Greece, somewhere in the Mediterranean. The 7% actually makes sense because for some reason my brother looks something like this. Maybe he got more of those genes. And then there's assorted genes from the rest of Europe and even 2% Jewish, 1% Middle Eastern. So there must have been an interesting story in there somewhere. The oddest thing is that I thought when I'd find out, I'd feel different somehow. I don't know. But to be honest, maybe it's just from having my own suspicions for this entire time, but I don't really feel different at all. Yeah, I may have ancestors from this certain place, but I'm 100% American. I lived in Ohio my entire life. I like football, stars and stripes, that sort of thing. Also, I had a friend who started loving a certain country way too much once he found out he had heritage from it, so I'm not gonna go down that path. But learning about where your ancestors came from does tell a fascinating story, and it can be quite an experience. Honestly, I suggest you give it a try. We're in an age now where you can find out your history just from spitting in a tube, so why not try it out? Ancestry DNA is an international service available in 30 or so markets, so really anybody can use it, not just Americans. Discover details about your unique family history and go to ancestry.com/althistory or click on the link in the description to get a 10% discount. If you find anything out, then tweet using the hashtag #MyAncestry. This is Cody of Alternate History Hub.
Cool. I've never done one of those. I've kind of always wanted to, just to see. I mean, I know I'm a mutt of a bunch of different things. You look at my mother and father's sides; they have very different branches of history that come out of that. So I've heard funny stories too of people doing that and totally finding out they're not at all what they expected, and even ones where there's you find out you were adopted. I've heard stories of that. Yeah, I do not share because you have your whole family does it or something like that, and they do it, and you compare, and you're like, whoa, I'm completely different than my parents or my brothers and sisters. I've heard of that doing weird things, but anyway, back to the video though. So yeah, a lot of what ifs that happen there. I do think that there's definitely a lot of possibilities. I need to absorb some of that more, but yeah, things like the region of Canada being even more French, which I agree with, although it's still being ruled by the British. Okay, still being ruled by the British, because that was already established after the 7 Years' War, in the 1750s. There, Native Americans may, if the British hold up with the deals that they made with them during the war to preserve their lands, then you might get more of that, especially in the southeast United States, would still be very Native American, which today it is not, because those people got pushed out west a couple decades after the Revolution or the creation of the United States, so they got pushed out west. So you'd have that, and now, I don't know. I don't think, though, that the British are going to take over the whole North American continent, because they would have had to still deal with the French. Because if they're saying there wasn't going to be a French Revolution, then there wasn't going to be Napoleon, and the French may still be holding on to that whole middle third of the United States, so what's today the United States. So if the British wanted to expand further west, because those revolutions don't happen, then they would still potentially be dealing with France and potentially Spain for the western half of North America. Plus, they would still have their colonies I still definitely believe they still have their colonies in India and then into Africa and stuff like that. So I don't think it just becomes totally dominated. North America just gets totally dominated by the British. I think that's a little bit too far to take it. but I could see it being attempted in a way, and possibly. But I know I'm siding on the other side of that just a little bit there. I did propose that idea too. I wonder if some of the hardcore Americans would then have tried to leave and go a little bit further west. But that would be hard though, because now that I'm thinking about it, because the where anti-British sentiment was strongest was in port cities, places that were in constantly dealing with the British, which was at port cities. They were city businessmen. Okay, because the more countryside folk, uh, British support was stronger there than it was in the cities. So getting out of, what I'm trying to say is those patriots leaving those would have had to leave those cities into places the British didn't have as much of an impact, which would be more in the heart of America, which now that I think about it may not have happened, because that would have been a completely different change of livelihood. Unless they want to go all the way to the West Coast and develop, port cities over there. But I mean, that would be very difficult to do though. So I don't know, maybe. Now, does the French Revolution again never happen? I'm not sure about that, because France already had economic issues, because that's so much of that stems with their tax collecting process from the three estates, and how the first two estates, which only made up 3% of their population, but received so much of the income, they don't pay taxes, they get special privileges and stuff. Because the French Revolution was a societal thing too, to end these social class divisions. So I think the revolution still has a likelihood of happening, and they didn't really get into that. They seem to be pretty adamant, maybe, that it didn't, but maybe still happens. But you still may not get a Napoleon. I think that's true. Whether there's with that or not, he didn't have to happen, because that's based on timing of when he lived and stuff like that. Now, the French Revolution may have been sped up because of the American Revolution, right? And then putting it into the Napoleon timeline. But if it had come later or less intense, then you don't get the Napoleon timeline. So, and that could have a lot of effects. And I didn't think of that as far as the effect it would have on Europe as much, the domino effect, because the coalitions that are created to end Napoleon's reign there brought nationalism that created against stuff like Germany and the end of the Holy Roman Empire and that kind of stuff. So there's definitely a timeline there of influence that those nations maybe don't exist. But maybe it just delays something that's the inevitable. Might be putting too much. But you really can't have one of these alternate history videos, at least not an interesting one, without having all of those steps. So as always, I'm very impressed of how these guys, they really, really spread out the effects. I like that they don't just stick to one branch of a tree that's created, because alternate history does not change history in a linear fashion. It changes it into a big branch. And one thing I really like with them is they see all the connections. I really enjoy that they do that. So anyway, just wanted to put out my ideas there and get that. Do you agree with me? Do you agree with them? Do you think they're right? Do you think they're wrong? You can get conversations going. Definitely, you can add your thoughts down into the YouTube comments and talk to people. Or again, better yet, come join our community over at Discord. There's a link down in the description. You come talk about this stuff too with a lot of history-minded people as well. All right, so on our way out here, thanks again to our patron pledgers. They're the ones who voted on this in this week's poll. If you'd like to get involved in that, there's a link to where you can get involved in Patreon down below as well. So thank you for that. Thanks to everyone that's been supporting the channel and through those kind of means. But thank you especially to anyone really who's just being a part of our community here, watching videos, hopefully learning more about history and just trying to promote history education, which is what I'm trying to do here. All right, with that, we'll go ahead and call it here, and we'll see you guys next time. Bye.